Oh, let me change this one error. All right, we're about to go live. Just give me 1 second. I have to, of course, there's a little error real quick. Let's get us started. All right, we're ready to rock and roll. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn with Purse Strings. My name is Maggie, and we're so excited to have you here today. We're going to be talking about financial planning and why it's so necessary for so many, big life transitions. So for those who are new here, Purse Strings is all about providing tips, tricks, pieces of advice on how to be financially fearless. And then when you're either going through a big transition, buying and selling a home, maybe getting divorced, planning for retirement, we have top tier financial professionals willing, ready, and able to serve you. Oleg is one of them, and we're so excited to have him on today to share his expertise. But before we dive into all of that, Oleg, could you give us a little intro of who you are and what you do?
Of course. Maggie, very excited to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Oleg, and I'm the Director of Financial Planning at Proxy Financial. I've been in the industry for about 12 years, which with the combined fact that I manage a team of younger advisors who have their own books of business has given me quite a depth of knowledge of the various types of clients that exist in the world in the United States, and has given me a very unique perspective in guiding those clients and identifying exactly what their needs are, even though they might not realize that.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have this conversation today, and anyone tuning in live, feel free to post any questions and we'll work on getting to those. If you're watching the replay, you can put them in the comments and we'll work on coming back to those. But we're just going to kind of dive in here. And so, Oleg, what are some of these most significant life changes or transitions that would really trigger someone to consider, putting a financial plan into place? I always feel like there's some moment that really, it's like gives you that wake up call.
Yeah, so there are definitely some key life events that trigger the need for financial planning, but I would say that this is a little bit of a loaded question because the reality is you can always benefit from financial planning, no matter what stage of life you're in. The reality is that there's a lot of information on the internet, specifically places like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and most of them are sound bites. So people seem to have a very fractured amount of knowledge of how to be financially well. And the reality is that by speaking to a professional, whether you engage in that long term or you're just looking to get some more well-rounded information and maybe get a little bit of a roadmap for what you could or should be doing, it's, the earlier you make these decisions, the more fruitful your financial life will be. So there are some very early life events that trigger financial planning. They're very simple things like, starting out your career, transitioning to a new job, more big life events like getting married, having children, and later on in life, unfortunately, on the negative side, getting divorced, losing a spouse, having to have a dependent that is outside of your immediate family, various things like that. And in particular, this is a large problem that women tend to contend with, as unfortunately the industry isn't necessarily built to support the women demographic.
Yeah, definitely. And the one transition I always think of is, someone might get a huge windfall and not know what to do with it. But like you said, there are all these sound bites. And so meeting with somebody can really help make like a plan for you as a unique individual versus this cookie cutter soundbite you're trying to piece together.
Yeah, not to mention that people tend to associate financial planning with very large general, areas like needing to get an estate plan done or needing to get your investments allocated appropriately, or the big thing on everyone's minds all the time is how do I lower my taxes?
Yeah.
The reality is that there are so many more adjacent things that can be handled through financial planning, like thinking about your parents long term, which I know was a big topic of conversation in previous months.
Yeah.
And again, this tends to happen a lot more with women because statistically, women tend to be the caretakers, specifically daughters for aging parents. So there are a lot of these things that tend to come up in life that people will just push through without knowing what their options for a plan of attack are. And usually, financial planning is a very gentle field in the industry. There's no such thing as pushing recommendations, especially when you're working with a holistic professional. The conversation is more about educating you as to what your options are, and then making an educated decision that fits not only your short and long-term goals, but whatever the situation calls for in that moment.
Right, definitely. And so, as you know, as we've talked about before, and research shows, women tend to earn less than men in their lifetimes, but they also live longer. So it really makes financial planning more critical. So, can you speak to some of the unique financial challenges that women face and how to plan or address these challenges?
Yes. So I don't want to generalize. People come in very different packages. They have very different needs and very different philosophies for how to live their lives. And this goes even deeper on a cultural level. But over the last 10 years, there have been two very prevalent trends that have been coming out, and the first of which is that women are starting to take over finances more and more. The second is that between men and women, men tend to be a lot more return oriented, whereas women tend to be a lot more goal oriented. And unfortunately, our industry, especially dating back 20, 30 years, has been constructed around returns. That's the primary topic of conversation with any financial advisor, or in a lot of cases, financial planners that you come across. So everything's about the hard numbers. But the industry needs to make an adjustment to be a lot more focused, not just on returns. Returns are important, but I'll let you in on a little bit of a secret. No one has a crystal ball in finance, and if anyone's promising you returns or overly focusing on returns, that's probably just as a form of distraction.
Yeah.
The reality is that most people need to sleep at night. They need to have comfort and reassurances that not only are they making the right decisions, but that they're moving in the right direction. And a lot of these challenges that women face are, as they're becoming more and more involved in finance, a lot of the times they're meeting professionals that are a lot more focused on the other, perspective on those returns. And you need to vet the professionals you work with, bottom line.
Yeah.
And, that applies to me as well. I'm not the perfect fit for every prospect that come across my table. And a lot of the times I'll let them know that. And so even with working with purse strings professionals, all of who are, very well vetted and, doing the right thing, you also need to find someone that understands your needs and understands what you prioritize. And a lot of that has to do with just listening. And, the industry doesn't quite meet that requirement just yet. So a lot of us, especially of the younger generation, are pushing towards that. There's a new kind of philosophy of advising. And, you'll hear this word a lot: holistic financial planning.
Yeah, definitely. Because we always say how men are usually focused, broad brush, men are focused on the ROI or the return on investment, where women are like, is everyone covered? Is my family okay? The numbers don't mean much. If I said, yeah, it's, 3 times, that doesn't always make sense. I want to know, is everyone protected? Is everyone okay? I don't really care what the number is at the end of the day, but is everyone covered?
Yeah.
And so really having a connection with a couple professionals and finding the best fit, that way you can really bond, open up, and really share what your goals are.
And I mean, this trend, we all know for a long time, men are more risk tolerant.
Yeah.
And that has a lot more to do with financial planning than most people realize, because when we're talking about risks, we're not just talking about the numbers. We're not just talking about what you stand to lose financially. It's more like what you stand to lose materially, personally, mentally, emotionally. So financial planning isn't just a mathematical discipline. It's a people discipline. It's about understanding the person that you're working with and vibing on their level, and, making adjustments to whatever you may be doing, regularly, to become more, reliant on what the client needs and what they're looking to achieve throughout their life. And a lot of the times clients will be conflicted. I mean, that's the reality of things. We're complex individuals. Sometimes we have conflicting goals. And then at that point, that's when you need to have a combination of your list of priorities and what your financial professional recommends as a list of priorities, because there are certain risks that you just can't wait around for. And that kind of brings us back to our earlier question of what triggers financial planning. Well, when you're part of a couple, of a unit,
Yeah.
you have some flexibility with not necessarily needing to plan all that far ahead. But life happens, and people lose their spouses at a young age, at a normal age, at a late age. Doesn't really matter. The point is that when you have the first loss, you have a little bit of room of flexibility, just because of how our inheritance laws work, and there's transference of assets and things like that. But at that point, you immediately need to focus in on what happens tomorrow. And at that point, in some cases, maybe it's already too late to take certain steps to protect yourself, for example. That ship has sailed. Now your reality is what it is. Whereas you could have made adjustments for that a long time before that. And, a lot of that has to do with things like estate planning and, just making those decisions ahead of time. But, a lot of the misconceptions in the field are that you have to make changes every single time there's a life event like that. If you're working with a professional that looks out long enough, you're making those plans well ahead of any adjustments, and you're tracking them year over year, and maybe occasionally you're making a change because there's been a material change in your life. But you don't necessarily need to wait for those moments, nor do those moments mean things need to change if you've already done the work ahead of time.
Definitely. And I just want to kind of highlight again how, being proactive and have these conversations before they happen gives you so many more options and opportunities to kind of help and protect yourself. Because sometimes, once the ship has sailed, you got to work with what you got. But, if you do some of this stuff proactively and have an advisor who really looks out over time, you have more options, and you have some more ways to be proactive and protect yourself from these different things. Even though you couldn't protect yourself that someone passed, maybe it's the best of, they had the life insurance policy or whatever it may be.
Exactly. Yeah, it's important, especially for early conversations, to work with a professional that asks. Your first meeting should be all led by the advisor, asking questions that, again, may surprise people. If you're being surprised by the questions your financial advisor is asking, you probably are working with a pretty good financial advisor.
That's a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
And so, as we know, women are more likely than men to kind of break their career or work part-time for caregiving responsibilities, whether if that's their own kids or their parents or a loved one. And so how can financial planning account for these interruptions and help women, stay on track for these long-term financial goals?
Right. So this is really what this comes down to, is a conversation about cash flow management. It's about making sure that not only are you building in what we would refer to as various investment buckets. So let's call it emergency savings, maybe a cash cushion aside from that, your taxable monies, which are the ones that you would lean on first once your cash ran out. Also the ones that would be making a return for you over time. Then you have your qualified assets, so your traditional 401ks, your traditional IRAs. And then you have your Roth assets, which kind of could fall in either category depending on what time frame and what the situation is, because those assets you've already paid the taxes on. Generally, we consider it the last assets you use, but you could always tap that ahead of time if the situation calls for. But all that is to say is that you need to have all of these different buckets available, because each one can correspond to a specific life situation and a specific life need. And a financial planner would be able to guide you with when to use certain assets, how to use certain assets, and maybe what to lean on temporarily or long term if these situations come up. But the reality is you can never predict a long interruption of income. So there are certain scenarios we can plan for. There are certain scenarios we can't. There's very little to account for if it's something that's not a disability that you could then get replacement income for. Long-term care is a very big conversation nowadays. which, statistically actually happens a lot more frequently to people under the age of 65 than one might think. It's something like 1/3 of long-term care policies get triggered before that age. And, there are certain things and certain, let's call it products in the industry that have a bad rap. And historically, maybe they have a bad rap for good reasons or the right reasons, but that doesn't mean that those products or those services aren't necessary for you. So it's important to identify exactly what your risks are and then weigh the cost of, accounting for that or not accounting for it. This applies very heavily to life insurance products of various types, but this also may apply to making deferred contributions. Maybe with what your life situation is like, let's say, for example, single mother, 2 kids, working a job, the risks in that scenario are a lot higher if she were to lose her income. And there are very few things that can balance that. So maybe in certain situations, maybe your health's not great. You can anticipate that maybe something might happen eventually. Maybe you don't want to contribute so much to qualified accounts. Maybe you don't want to maximize those. Maybe you need to build out your cash reserves because you live dollar to dollar otherwise. So there are certain sacrifices that sometimes need to be made. Optimization and financial planning doesn't necessarily mean you're maximizing everything. You can't maximize everything. You have to sacrifice certain goals, certain decisions to account for certain risks. And, personally, I'm a very conservative planner. I'm always very risk oriented. And my advice generally tends to lean to protect yourself first, pay yourself first, and then enjoy the fruits of your labor when the time is right.
And it's so interesting once you learn more about finances, how each bucket, a dollar in this bucket is not always the same as a dollar in that bucket and this bucket, the way they grow, the way the taxes are, and all these different things. And so having those different buckets, like you were talking about, and planning that so you know which ones to pull from properly are really essential because, pulling money out of your Roth is way different than pulling your money early out of a 401k. You're losing a lot of money. And so making sure you're planning that properly is essential. Just, in case something happens, where to grab that money from.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really a conversation about making sure you have enough liquidity. And liquidity means a lot more than just having cash on hand. Taxable investments for the most part are liquid, unless they're, fixed income treasuries, things like that. But even 401k assets are actually a lot more accessible than people think. In case of emergencies, there's always, well, not always, there's sometimes the option of taking a loan from a 401k, which isn't a taxable event, unless you miss the deadline of paying it back. But that's part of the conversation you're having. If we're looking at an option of taking out a loan, are we certain we're going to be able to pay it back in time? Because if the answer is no, then that's no longer the recommendation. And it's all about having a fluid conversation and being honest, transparent, and in a lot of cases vulnerable to your situation and your needs. Because the reality is, especially if you're working with a fiduciary professional, there shouldn't be any conflicts of interest. The goal is to get you from point A to point B as easily and as happily as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And will you just redefine for our audience what fiduciary means? I know it's always a big word that kind of...
Absolutely. Yeah. So a fiduciary in simplest terms is someone that is obligated not just to you as the client, but also to our regulators to operate in your best interest, which means not only do we have to educate and justify you on the recommendations, we have to have, foolproof justification with a paper trail, making sure that all of this is appropriate. And there are some gray areas because, again, like I said, it is a fluid conversation. But the point is that you're presenting all of the options and you're presenting them both materially and factually. So fiduciaries in the general financial services industry are the top tier professional for third-party objective advice.
Yeah, exactly. Which I know is always kind of leading into our next question but I know some people kind of feel hesitancy going to a professional because they just don't want to be pushed a product, which is why, at Purse Strings, we never start with sales. We always start with this education, but some people might want to choose a fiduciary because they can't push you a product. They have to always work in your best interest.
There's a little bit of a caveat there, and this is something that definitely exists in the industry. Most times not maliciously, but sometimes, there's always that type of professional. A fiduciary can sell your product. What that means is they're
Right.
usually dual licensed, but it's very important that everyone knows that the second they're involved in that sale, their fiduciary hat comes off.
Hmm.
They stop being a fiduciary temporarily for that sale. With that said, the recommendation itself has to follow the fiduciary standard, so you're
Right.
usually still getting that top tier advice. But yes, just to clarify that point a little bit,
Definitely.
um, we are not allowed to make commissions, so everything we're
Right.
making is fully transparent.
Which, yeah, that's so important. And so, many women, feel either intimidated or overwhelmed by financial planning. And so, what are some practical steps that they can take to kind of get started and gain confidence in managing their finances?
I think this comes back to working with the right professional. It's
Right.
very hard to convince yourself that you're making the right decisions, but when you have a professional that is gentle and guiding and is reassuring of the steps that you're taking, that's really the only or the biggest way to build that confidence. And you know, sometimes you could be reassuring and still not be the best fit. I truly believe in shopping around before
Right.
settling for any one professional, and even then, generally speaking, there's no hard commitments to working with your financial advisor, or in a lot of cases, your parents' financial advisor, which we're seeing a big transition of right now. Um, so there's, all of our agreements, all of our contracts, they're meant to protect the client, not to protect the advisor. So you always have the autonomy and you always have the ability and power to walk away and find something else, or even, work with multiple professionals. That's also something that's, very, very common. And what I would say, I mean, this is just a personal opinion. I wouldn't set this as a standard, so please take this with a grain of salt. Your professionals should want to work together,
Yeah.
because there shouldn't be any direct competition between advisors unless one of them is doing something wrong. And if they're doing something wrong, then it's pretty easy to identify and point that out.
Yeah.
So your team of professionals, and I really do emphasize team, because your
Yeah.
advisor should be your first point of contact for anything that's going on in your life, whether it's an accounting principle or an estate planning principle or just a life event. They're going to be the ones to guide you with who to speak to next, and they should be on speaking terms with those professionals as well, because that's what creates synergy, and that's what I like to say is the glue of your financial life. Just having that one or two people in place in the middle to be able to coordinate the efforts of everyone else.
Right. Yeah. We're definitely about that team. And, you need someone to help with those taxes and to do these different things and to really help you out. And so, don't be afraid to introduce your professionals or group email or, whatever it is, because they want to know each other. You don't just have to be the middleman and they're going to fight for your business. They're working together to help empower you and to, help you on your roadmap. So if everyone's a good professional like they are at Purse Strings, everyone will really work together to help empower you and make that best plan for you.
Yeah, exactly.
And then can you share an example of, clients who've come to you in a major life event or transition and how you help them create a financial plan to meet their goals and needs?
Yeah, so I have a few examples that I'm thinking of just to create the range of what it
Yeah.
is that can trigger financial planning. I actually have a lot of clients who are on the younger side, so anywhere between mid to late 20s all the way through like late 30s, early 40s, who are just getting their life started. They may have like very, very young children. They're starting to plan for really big decisions, not only in their lives but in the lives of their children. And so I had a couple come to me recently who were very, very concerned about their savings. They have several goals. Unfortunately, several of them are conflicting. Not from the perspective of, well, you can't do this if you're doing this because of the risks. It's more so they just don't have enough cash to support each and every one of those. So they have to kind of balance what is the most important thing in what order. And the funny thing is that they're incredibly high earners, and their savings rate is apparent if you look at it, over a long-term period of time. For them, they were just concerned because it wasn't consistent, and that actually
Mhm.
happens a lot. You can't have consistent expenses. Some months may be more expensive than others. Some months you could have a bigger savings rate.
Right.
Maybe you get your bonuses at really irregular intervals. Um, Maybe you overpay your taxes and your return is what we consider your savings.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of financial planning is really just restructuring the framework of your client of how they think about their own lives and their finances. And, I've been working with them over the last couple of months, and I've been able to identify confidently that, this savings rate exists. You may not see it month to month, and you move it around from account to account, but it's sitting right there. You may have
Right.
earmarked it for a certain goal or objective, so it kind of flies out of your mind once you know it's already allocated for something, but it's there, it's working for you, and you're building on top of it. Not to mention that there is always room for optimization with taxes and
Yeah.
deferrals and creating more of that cash flow. So that's just a very simple example of early stage life financial planning. A deeper conversation would be something like someone who's looking to retire, whether it's a couple or a single individual. And most people genuinely don't know when it is appropriate or okay to retire based on their financial situations. And I know almost everyone watching this has probably seen this at one point or another. On your 401k website, there is always a little box that shows the trajectory of your money and how much you might need in retirement. And almost 9 times out of 10, it's undercounting and it's telling you don't have enough to retire. And, a lot of these things contribute to the growing fear of retirement, especially in today's conditions where retirement expenses are growing, health expenses are growing, and frankly, inflation is at an all-time high.
Yeah.
But no matter where you are in relation to your retirement, you could always make decisions to adjust that timeline, and it's about establishing that timeline. So, figuring out what has already been saved, how much more you'd have to save in order to retire by a certain point, and whether there's anything you could do in retirement to help prolong the assets that you have already saved. And just to throw out an example, Roth conversion timelines are very, very powerful in creating longevity of assets, or even for creating preferential legacy for future beneficiaries. So that's a pretty big example of what we're seeing a lot. The trend shows that people tend to wait a little too long to talk about retirement with their financial team. So always encourage early conversations, even if it's 10, 20, 30 years away. It's not about locking something in. It's about creating reasonable expectations.
Again, just being proactive, you can really then plan for the future. And I was posting these different TikToks and stuff, and somebody's like, yeah, I'll probably have to work all through my retirement. And I was like, the word probably means that you haven't looked at the numbers.
Exactly.
And so at least if you knew, then you could start making a plan around that. Or you can have the sigh of relief for the rest of your working life, knowing that this is the date or close to, and you won't have to work in your retirement. And that's really relieving, but the word probably means that you haven't really looked at it. And so having these conversations are so essential, just so you can plan, pull from the right buckets, allocate the right way, so you can make your dreams come true.
Yeah. And I think just a closing point, if it'll serve anyone, just having the conversation would at least give them better expectations for what their lives in retirement might look like, because that is a big misconsideration that clients have. There are certain rules of thumb in the industry that kind of govern how you could compare your working life, financial life, and expenses with how that might look in retirement. The reality is a little bit more stark than that. And you need to have reasonable expectations going in that while some expenses might go away, a lot of them won't. And a lot of them might even increase. Not to mention, you can't just sit around doing nothing in retirement. You should be enjoying your money. You should have more luxury expenses. You should have more hobbies, things like that. And hey, if you want to work part-time, fantastic. We're thrilled to hear it when clients want some kind of part-time job or hobby or something that earns an income. Because first of all, it makes them happy, it keeps them occupied. But more importantly, we know that there's something else that they could rely on.
Right. And yeah, making that plan in advance, if you knew like, oh, this would be my favorite kind of part-time job, but I'm in retirement, making that plan earlier is awesome. And then you can kind of, yeah, get all your goals aligned there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So I feel like we've covered a ton of great information today. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure is shared?
I really just want to emphasize, shop around, find someone that matches your personality and your need. Occasionally, a good financial planner will make you uncomfortable. And if you're feeling uncomfortable, just ask why, because sometimes they're pointing out what you're afraid to acknowledge, and you need to kind of, come to terms with certain realities. So I would say shop around, make sure your advisors are asking the right questions, and you could always get a third party opinion, and
Yeah,
it doesn't hurt.
definitely. So thank you again, Oleg, for coming on and sharing this information. If anyone has more questions or wants to reach out to Oleg, his email's been going through the bottom. He's also one of our Purse Strings approved professionals, so you can check him out on our site, pursestrings.co. And I know all of our professionals have, 15 to 30-minute free consultation call just to make sure it's the right connection, make sure you kind of feel like it's a good fit before you really dive in. So take advantage of that, talk to a couple of professionals and find the best fit for you. So you're prepared for really whatever comes at your way. So thank you again, Oleg, for coming on, and we'll talk to everyone again next week.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.